In a busy downtown area, the day seemed like any other for FBI agent Marcus Johnson. He was on an undercover mission, blending in with the crowd, his eyes scanning the streets as he walked. His assignment was secret, and he had to stay low profile, just another face in the sea of people hustling around the city. Marcus had worked in law enforcement for over a decade, dealing with everything from high-stakes investigations to undercover operations. He was calm, composed, and always ready for anything, until today. As Marcus walked through the crowd, he noticed a police officer approaching him. The officer, who looked to be in his late 30s, wore a stern expression as he scanned Marcus up and down. Marcus wasn't concerned at first. Being in law enforcement himself, he knew how often officers interacted with civilians. But something about the officer's gaze made Marcus uneasy. The officer's eyes were narrow, as if he were trying to figure out whether Marcus was someone he should be suspicious of. Before Marcus could even say anything, the officer stepped directly in front of him, blocking his path. "Hey, stop right there," the officer barked, his tone sharp and demanding. Marcus froze, confused by the sudden demand. He hadn't been doing anything out of the ordinary. The officer didn't wait for Marcus to respond. Instead, he reached out, grabbing his arm forcefully. "You're coming with me," the officer said. Marcus, still in disbelief, instinctively pulled back, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I'm FBI," Marcus stated calmly, trying to de-escalate the situation. "I'm on duty. You need to let me go." The officer wasn't having it. His grip on Marcus's arm tightened. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You're under arrest." Marcus could feel the officer's hand on his arm tightening, and he realized the situation was quickly escalating. He knew he had to stay calm. This wasn't just about an arrest. It was about his identity being questioned in public, and worse, it was about a fellow officer questioning him without any reason. "I'm FBI agent Marcus Johnson," Marcus said again, this time pulling out his badge and holding it up, hoping it would clear up the confusion. "I'm not the person you're looking for. I'm just trying to get to a meeting." He could feel the heat rising in his chest as he said the words. Every part of him wanted to shout, to make the officer realize he was being unjustly detained, but he kept his voice steady, hoping to avoid an unnecessary confrontation. But the officer wasn't interested in hearing any explanation. "Yeah, sure you are," the officer said dismissively, not even bothering to look at the badge. "I've heard it all before." He shot a glance over his shoulder at another officer nearby. Marcus tried to make sense of what was happening. Was he being arrested because of a misunderstanding? Was there something wrong with his identification? The idea that a fellow officer could be so dismissive of his badge didn't sit right with him. As the officer moved to handcuff Marcus, the crowd around them began to take notice. People stopped walking and looked on, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Marcus could feel the eyes of the public on him, but he tried not to let it distract him. He needed to get out of this situation. He had to remain calm and assert his rights. "Look, please," Marcus started to say, but the officer wasn't listening. He grabbed Marcus's wrist with more force, yanking him toward the curb. "You're coming with me," the officer repeated, this time dragging him in a direction he didn't want to go. Marcus couldn't understand it. He had been a part of many tense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of a criminal suspect being arrested. This was about a fellow officer not believing him simply because of the way he looked. The officer was treating him like a criminal without any reasonable cause. At this point, Marcus realized that he wasn't going to talk his way out of this. He was being arrested, and nothing was going to stop it unless he complied. He was frustrated, hurt, and deeply offended by the officer's blatant disregard for his identity. But as an FBI agent, he knew that pushing back in this situation would only make things worse. Instead, Marcus stood still, allowing the officer to put the handcuffs on him. His mind raced, thinking about how this simple moment had taken a dangerous turn. He wasn't sure how things had gotten this bad, but he knew he needed to stay composed. His thoughts briefly flashed to his training, reminding himself that this was just another test, another challenge to handle with professionalism. All Marcus could think about now was the mission that was slipping further and further away as he was dragged through the streets by a police officer who refused to believe he was who he said he was. The truth didn't matter. His badge, his identity, none of it seemed to matter to this officer. The city around him seemed to blur as the officer continued to pull him forward, ignoring his explanations and dragging him deeper into the mess that had been created out of a simple misunderstanding. Marcus could only hope that this wouldn't escalate further. But in his gut, he knew that things were about to get a lot more complicated. Marcus could feel the pressure of the handcuffs biting into his wrists as Officer Stevens roughly pulled him toward the squad car. The crowd had started to gather, murmuring and pointing, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Marcus kept his eyes on the ground, trying to remain calm despite the injustice he was facing. His mind was racing. How had it come to this? One moment he had been just another person in the crowd, and the next he was being treated like a criminal. The frustration bubbled up inside him, but he kept his emotions in check. It was clear that this officer wasn't going to listen to him. Officer Stevens didn't say another word as he walked Marcus toward the car. He didn't even look at the badge Marcus was still holding up, his expression cold and uninterested. The officer was focused on his task, dragging Marcus along as if he were just another suspect to cuff and throw into the back of a police vehicle. Marcus knew he had to find a way out of this, but everything he tried to say seemed to fall on deaf ears. As they reached the car, another officer stepped out and gave Marcus a quick glance. This officer was tall, with a more neutral expression on his face. He didn't seem as hostile as Stevens, but he didn't step in to stop the arrest either. Marcus saw the officer look at the handcuffs, then back at Stevens, as if waiting for some kind of confirmation. Stevens didn't offer any explanation, and the officer didn't ask any questions. It was as if this was a routine stop, like it happened every day. Marcus couldn't believe how easily Stevens had dismissed him. Even though he had shown his FBI badge twice now, even though he had tried to explain himself, the officer had refused to listen. It wasn't just about being arrested. It was about being treated like he didn't matter. As Stevens opened the back door of the squad car and shoved Marcus inside, Marcus finally snapped. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising slightly, though he still tried to control it. "I'm an FBI agent. I'm telling you, you're making a huge mistake." The officer slammed the door behind him without a word, and the car began to move. The sound of the engine growled as they drove through the city, the streets blurring past in a rush. Marcus tried to stay calm, trying to think of what his next move should be. He knew he needed to keep his head together. The worst thing he could do now was lose his temper. Inside the car, it was eerily quiet. Marcus sat in the back, his hands still cuffed, staring out of the small window. He could see the world outside continuing on, as if nothing was happening. People were walking, cars were moving, and life seemed so normal. Yet here he was, wrongfully arrested for something he hadn't done. A feeling of helplessness crept over him, but he refused to let it take hold. He couldn't afford to feel sorry for himself. There had to be a way to fix this. A few minutes later, they arrived at a small police station. Stevens didn't say a word as he opened the car door and yanked Marcus out. This time, Marcus didn't resist. He was starting to realize that resistance would only make the situation worse, but he wasn't going to just sit back and accept what was happening to him either. The officers led him into a small holding room, the air inside thick with tension. As they closed the door behind him, Marcus sat down in a chair, trying to focus. He knew that if he just stayed calm, if he kept his head straight, he could get out of here. He couldn't let this be the end of it. He had too much work left to do. His job was too important. The minutes dragged on, but no one came to speak with him. Stevens remained outside the room, probably filing paperwork or going through the motions of the arrest. Marcus could hear muffled voices from down the hall but couldn't make out what they were saying. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. After what felt like forever, the door finally opened, and another officer stepped inside. This one was older, with graying hair and a much more respectful demeanor. He looked at Marcus with a concerned expression, as if he understood the severity of the situation. "Agent Johnson," the officer said, his voice calm. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. We'll get this sorted out." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He had heard that before, and he didn't trust it. He wanted to believe that someone would finally listen to him, but the way Stevens had treated him made it hard to trust anyone in this station. The officer continued, "Stevens made a mistake. He's been known to act impulsively. We'll look into it." Marcus nodded but said nothing. He was tired, mentally drained from trying to explain himself, from the frustration of being misjudged. He had been wrongfully arrested, and it wasn't just the arrest itself that bothered him. It was the fact that Stevens had made a decision based on his appearance, not his identity. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just an FBI agent. He was just another black man being treated with suspicion for no reason. The officer took a step back and nodded toward the door. "We'll get you out of here soon. Just sit tight." As the officer left the room, Marcus leaned back in the chair, his mind still racing. He had been in tough situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about making an arrest or solving a case. This was personal. It was about respect, about the prejudice that still lingered in places where it shouldn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The silence in the small holding room grew heavier as Marcus sat there, waiting for someone to finally take him seriously. His mind was spinning, replaying every moment from when he had first been stopped by Officer Stevens. How could this have happened? Why had Stevens chosen to arrest him, despite him showing his badge and explaining that he was an FBI agent? It didn't make sense. Marcus couldn't help but feel the sting of injustice, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly based on their appearance or assumptions. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been nearly an hour since the older officer had come in and told him that they would sort things out. Still, no one had returned to check on him. The longer he sat there, the more frustrated he became. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the questions in his mind kept piling up. Was Stevens really just acting on a mistake? Or was there something deeper at play here? Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the officer's behavior had more to do with his own biases than a simple misunderstanding. After all, Stevens hadn't even bothered to verify his story before going straight to arresting him. Marcus sighed and leaned forward in the chair, his cuffed hands resting on his lap. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but never like this. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay cool under pressure, but this was different. This was a personal attack on his character, and he couldn't just let it slide. He needed to make sure that Stevens was held accountable for his actions. As he sat there, a strange mixture of anger and exhaustion washed over him. The room felt stifling, and he could hear the distant sounds of people talking in the hallway outside. He knew there was a lot going on out there, but at that moment, it felt like the world had forgotten about him. Finally, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't an officer, at least, not one Marcus had seen before. A man in a suit walked in, carrying a folder. He looked about in his mid-30s, with short-cropped hair and a serious expression. The man paused for a moment, his gaze flicking over Marcus before he finally spoke. "Agent Johnson?" the man asked, his voice firm but not unfriendly. Marcus stood up, straightening his back. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" The man set the folder down on the table and looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested he was aware of the situation. "I'm Special Agent Thomas Blake. I'm with the FBI's Internal Affairs Division. I've been assigned to look into what happened here." Marcus blinked, his tension easing slightly. Finally, someone who would take him seriously. "I need you to know that I'm innocent. I'm an FBI agent, Officer Stevens." He just arrested me out of nowhere. I showed him my badge, but he didn't care. He just ignored everything I said. Agent Blake nodded, his face serious. I understand, Agent Johnson. We're aware of the situation. We've already started looking into Officer Stevens. He's got a history of being difficult to work with, and it's possible that his behavior was influenced by personal biases. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger that had been building up inside him. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about the bigger issue. Stevens didn't just arrest me because of a mistake. He treated me like a criminal based on how I look, not because of anything I did. Blake's face softened, but there was a fire in his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what Marcus was saying. I know, and that's why we're investigating. We're taking this very seriously. Marcus felt a small sense of relief, though he knew the road ahead would be difficult. The feeling of being wrongfully arrested, the humiliation of having his identity questioned in front of a crowd, was still fresh in his mind. He had been forced to endure this treatment because of who he was, not because of what he had done. And that was a hard truth to swallow. Blake continued, "We're going to make sure this is looked into thoroughly. Officer Stevens is under investigation right now, and we're going to review any other complaints that may have been filed against him in the past." He paused, then added, "But this isn't just about Stevens. We need to take a close look at the system as a whole. How did this happen? Why did Stevens think it was okay to arrest you without verifying your identity? These are questions we're going to ask." For the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus felt like he wasn't alone. Agent Blake was showing real concern for what had happened to him, and he was taking the situation seriously. But Marcus knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The system was complicated, and change was never immediate. Still, he couldn't let that stop him. If he gave up now, Stevens would win. He had to make sure that something good came out of this, even if it was just one small step toward justice. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice quieter now. "But I want to make sure this isn't swept under the rug. I want everyone to know what happened. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through." Blake looked at him with a nod of understanding. "That's exactly why we're doing this. We want the truth to come out. It won't be easy, but we'll get there." As Blake stood to leave, he turned back to Marcus. "We'll keep you updated on the progress of the investigation. You'll be hearing from us soon. And Agent Johnson," he added, his voice softening, "I'm sorry this happened to you." Marcus didn't respond at first. He just nodded, the weight of the day finally starting to settle on his shoulders. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since he was arrested, Marcus felt a small spark of hope. Something would be done. He wouldn't let Stevens or anyone else get away with something like this. Marcus sat back in the chair, the door closing softly behind Agent Blake. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened so far. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, he had been going about his business, minding his own business, and now he found himself caught up in something much bigger than himself. It wasn't just about the wrongful arrest anymore. It was about a system that had failed him, a system that had allowed this injustice to happen in the first place. The holding room felt small and claustrophobic as Marcus tried to process everything. He could feel the handcuffs digging into his wrists, but they no longer bothered him as much as they had before. It was almost like his body had become numb to the physical discomfort. His thoughts kept going back to the look on Officer Stevens' face when he had arrested him. The way Stevens had dismissed him so quickly, the way he had been so quick to assume that Marcus was guilty of something without even asking a single question. It wasn't just frustrating. It was deeply hurtful. It was like Stevens had seen him not as an FBI agent, but just another black man to suspect. Marcus had grown up understanding the harsh realities of the world, but he had always tried to push through, to rise above. He had worked hard to get where he was, to become an FBI agent. He had earned that badge, and yet here he was, treated as if it meant nothing. It was hard to swallow. But even as the anger and frustration bubbled up inside him, he knew he had to stay focused. He couldn't let himself get distracted. He had a bigger goal now, to make sure this didn't happen again, not to him and not to anyone else. He looked up as the door opened again. This time, it wasn't another officer, but a woman in a business suit. She was tall, with long brown hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She had an air of professionalism about her. And for a moment, Marcus wondered if she was with Internal Affairs as well. "Agent Johnson?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. She stepped into the room and gave him a reassuring smile. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I'm Agent Laura Harris, and I've been assigned to assist with your case." Marcus nodded. "I appreciate it," he said, still feeling the weight of the situation. "It's been a tough day." Agent Harris gave him a sympathetic look. "I can only imagine. The situation with Officer Stevens is serious, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. But for now, we need to get you out of here." That was the first good news Marcus had heard in a while. As much as he wanted to stay focused on the bigger picture, he couldn't deny that being stuck in that holding room was beginning to wear on him. He was tired, physically and emotionally drained, and the uncertainty of everything weighing on him wasn't helping. Harris turned to one of the officers in the hallway and nodded. A few moments later, the officer returned with the key to release Marcus from his handcuffs. The moment they were off, Marcus felt an odd sense of relief, even if it was just for the briefest moment. He rubbed his wrists, trying to get the blood flowing again, and then stood up, stretching his arms and legs. He was ready to get out of this place. "Thank you," he said to Harris, his voice a little more relaxed now. "I didn't expect this to go on so long. I thought this would be resolved sooner." Agent Harris nodded, leading him toward the exit. "I understand, and I want you to know that this investigation is a top priority for us. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that Officer Stevens is held accountable for his actions." As they walked down the hallway, Marcus couldn't help but wonder just how deep the problem went. Officer Stevens wasn't the only one who had acted on prejudice. It wasn't just his personal biases that had caused this situation. It was a reflection of a much larger issue. How many others had been treated the same way by officers who didn't take the time to understand their situation? How many others had been wrongfully arrested, just like him, because of who they were rather than what they had done? The thought made his stomach turn. The system was broken, and Marcus had always known it in the back of his mind. But now he had experienced it firsthand. He had been the victim of that broken system. It was something he would never forget. They reached the front of the station, where a black SUV was parked outside. Harris motioned for Marcus to get in, and they both climbed into the vehicle. The engine roared to life, and the car pulled away from the station. As the city streets passed by, Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, lost in his thoughts. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to see this through. Harris, sensing his deep contemplation, turned to him. "I know this isn't easy, but you've got people on your side now. We won't let this go. We'll keep pushing until justice is done." Marcus met her eyes and nodded. He was grateful for her words, but part of him still felt unsure. There was a long road ahead, and the battle wasn't over yet. "I just want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. For me, and for everyone else who's been wronged by this system," Marcus said quietly. "I understand," Harris said softly. "And we will. We'll make sure of it." The car continued to roll through the streets, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. But as they drove away from the police station, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop until things changed. No matter how difficult it would be, he would fight for justice, for himself and for everyone who had been treated unfairly. And he wasn't going to let anyone silence him or sweep this under the rug. The battle had just begun as the car continued to drive through the busy city streets. Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed in such a short amount of time. He had gone from being an agent with years of experience to someone who had been wrongfully detained, humiliated, and treated like a criminal. He could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs on his wrists, the way Officer Stevens had grabbed him and dragged him away, ignoring his badge, his identity, his entire being. It was something that would stick with him forever. But despite all of that, Marcus wasn't one to dwell on defeat. He had always believed in fighting for what was right, and now more than ever, he knew that he had to take action. This wasn't just about him. It was about exposing a much larger issue, a pattern of behavior that had affected so many others who had been unfairly targeted or treated based on their appearance, their race, or their background. As they drove on, Marcus's mind raced with plans. What would be the next step? How could he help make sure that the system would be held accountable? What would it take to make the people who were responsible for this kind of injustice change their ways? He wasn't sure yet, but he was determined to find out. Agent Harris, sensing that Marcus was deep in thought, didn't try to interrupt him. Instead, she drove quietly, her eyes focused on the road ahead. She knew that the emotional toll of everything he had gone through that day would be hard to shake. But she also understood that Marcus was a fighter. He wouldn't give up, not when he knew that there was so much more at stake than his own pride. After a few moments, Harris spoke up, breaking the silence. "I know this isn't easy, Marcus, but you should know that we're already gathering evidence. Officer Stevens has a history of complaints, and we're talking to people who've worked with him before. It's going to take some time, but we're committed to getting to the truth." Marcus nodded. It was reassuring to know that there were people on his side, people who cared about what had happened and were actively working to make sure justice was served. Still, he knew it wouldn't be simple. The wheels of justice often turned slowly, and sometimes it felt like the system was designed to protect those who shouldn't be protected. He'd seen it before in cases where misconduct was brushed under the rug or ignored altogether. "I just don't understand," Marcus said quietly, looking out the window. "How can someone like Stevens, someone who's supposed to be protecting and serving, treat me that way?" It wasn't just a mistake. It felt like he wanted to prove a point. Like he saw me as a threat before I even opened my mouth. Harris glanced over at him, her eyes filled with empathy. "I get it. I think the hardest part is knowing that this isn't just about one officer. It's about a mindset, about people who have biases, whether they realize it or not, and how those biases affect their actions. But that's exactly why we have to fight. We have to show that this kind of behavior is unacceptable." Marcus sat back in his seat, letting her words sink in. He understood what she was saying. Officer Stevens' actions weren't just personal. They were part of a larger problem. This wasn't just a case of one officer being in the wrong. It was about a culture, a belief system that allowed this type of behavior to continue without consequence. And that was the most frustrating part. He wasn't just fighting for his own rights. He was fighting to change a broken system that had allowed so many others to fall through the cracks. They drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. But Marcus couldn't help but think about all the people who might be out there, people who had been treated like he had. People who hadn't had the chance to stand up for themselves, or who had been too afraid to fight back. He thought about his family, his friends, and all the people who had always been there for him, encouraging him to pursue his dreams, to make a difference in the world. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let the world stay this way. As the car approached a quieter part of the city, Harris turned to Marcus again. "You know, you've been through something no one should have to go through. But it's how you respond to this moment that matters most. It's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to feel powerless. But you've already made the first step. You're not staying silent. You're not just walking away and letting this go. That's where change starts." Marcus looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. He couldn't afford to let this situation break him. He had to keep moving forward, even when it felt like everything was working against him. It wasn't just about his own sense of justice. It was about something bigger, something that could affect the future for others who came after him. It was about making sure that the next person didn't have to go through what he had. "We'll get through this," Marcus said, his voice steady now. "I'm not giving up. I can't. Not when so much is at stake. Harris gave him a reassuring smile. That's exactly the attitude we need. And you're not alone in this. We've got your back. As the car turned onto a quieter street, Marcus felt a sense of determination flood through him. It wasn't just about getting his name cleared. It was about creating a ripple effect, a change that would be felt long after this moment. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. This fight was far from over, but Marcus was more determined than ever to make sure that his voice, and the voices of those who had been ignored and mistreated, would finally be heard. And no matter what, he wouldn't stop until justice had been served. As the days went on, Marcus found himself struggling with the weight of what had happened. It wasn't just the injustice of being wrongfully arrested. It was the realization that things like this weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger issue that had been allowed to fester for far too long. While the investigation into Officer Stevens was moving forward, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. This was more than just his personal case. This was about setting a precedent, about making sure that no one else had to go through what he had. Agent Harris had been in constant contact with him, updating him on the progress of the investigation and assuring him that everything was moving in the right direction. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the system was working against him. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that change didn't come easy. The people with the power to make a difference were often the ones who were least likely to listen. It made him wonder how many other officers, just like Stevens, had been given free rein to act on their biases without consequence. It was a thought that weighed heavily on him. It was easy to get discouraged, to think that maybe this fight wasn't worth it. Maybe things would never change. But every time he felt like giving up, he thought back to the support he had received. He thought about the people who had believed in him, who had stood by him when everything had gone wrong. They were his strength, and he wouldn't let them down. One morning, Marcus received a call from Harris. She had good news. The investigation into Officer Stevens had uncovered several prior complaints against him, some dating back to before Marcus had even joined the FBI. It seemed like Stevens had a pattern of racially biased behavior, and his actions were starting to catch up with him. Marcus felt a small sense of relief, but it was tempered by the realization that this was just the tip of the iceberg. How many other officers were out there, acting the same way without fear of being caught? The next few days were a blur of meetings and interviews. Marcus was interviewed by Internal Affairs, as well as other members of the FBI who were involved in the investigation. They asked him about his arrest, about his interactions with Officer Stevens, and about his thoughts on the larger issue of racial bias in law enforcement. Marcus answered every question as honestly as he could, knowing that his testimony could be the key to exposing a deeper problem. But he also knew that it wasn't just about his story. It was about giving a voice to everyone who had been affected by the same kind of prejudice. During one of these interviews, Marcus spoke about his experiences growing up. He talked about how he had always known the world wasn't fair, how he had learned at an early age that some people would look at him and see only his skin color, not the person he was. It was a reality that had shaped his life, but it wasn't something he had ever allowed to hold him back. He had worked hard, done everything by the book, and still found himself caught in a system that had failed him. I didn't expect to be treated differently when I became an agent, Marcus explained, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But the moment Officer Stevens laid eyes on me, I wasn't an FBI agent anymore. I was just another black man in his way. That's how it felt. The room fell silent for a moment as the others in the room absorbed his words. It was clear that his testimony had made an impact. Marcus wasn't just telling his story. He was shedding light on a problem that had been ignored for far too long. This was bigger than one bad officer. This was about a culture that needed to change, and Marcus was determined to be part of that change. As the investigation continued, there were moments of progress, but also setbacks. Officer Stevens was placed on leave while the investigation moved forward, and there was talk of possible disciplinary action. But Marcus knew that getting justice for himself and for others wasn't going to be as simple as getting Stevens off the streets. It was going to take systemic change, something that couldn't happen overnight. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Marcus found himself sitting at his kitchen table, his mind racing. He thought about his family, his colleagues, the people who had supported him throughout this ordeal. They were the ones who had kept him going when he wanted to give up, when it felt like the weight of the world was too much to bear. He couldn't fail them. He couldn't let this moment slip by without making sure that something changed. He picked up his phone and dialed Harris's number. She answered on the first ring. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "I know it's been a tough few days, but I just wanted to update you. We've gathered more evidence. Stevens has a history, and we've got people who are willing to testify about how he's treated others. We're not backing down. We're making progress." Marcus felt a rush of relief, but he knew the real work was just beginning. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," he said. "We can't stop until things change." "We won't stop," Harris replied. "You're not alone in this." Marcus hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, his mind still racing. This wasn't just about getting justice for himself anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had been overlooked or mistreated by the system. He was determined to be part of the solution. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, Marcus felt like there was a real chance for change. It was a long road ahead, but he knew that if he kept fighting, things could be different. And that was a fight worth having. As the days passed, Marcus found himself caught in a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and endless paperwork. The investigation into Officer Stevens was gaining momentum, but the challenges were far from over. Every time Marcus thought things might calm down, something new came up that reminded him how deep the problem ran. It wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about confronting the larger issue of racism and bias within law enforcement. He had always believed in justice, but now he understood more than ever how fragile that ideal could be. Internal Affairs had been working tirelessly, gathering statements from witnesses who had seen Stevens act inappropriately. They were compiling a file on his history, which was filled with complaints from other officers and civilians alike. But Marcus knew that even with all this evidence, the real work had just begun. He had seen how the system could protect its own, no matter how much evidence there was to the contrary. The fight was bigger than just Stevens. It was about exposing a culture that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. Late one night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, looking over the notes and reports he had been gathering. The weight of everything was starting to feel overwhelming. He thought back to his training days, when he had joined the FBI, with hopes of making a real difference in the world. He had never imagined that he would be fighting not just for justice, but for his own dignity and safety. But that was the reality now. Every day felt like a battle. His phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. It was a message from Harris. "We need to talk. There's been a new development." His heart skipped a beat. What could it be this time? He quickly typed back, agreeing to meet her the next morning. The next day, Marcus and Harris met at a small cafe, away from the usual FBI offices. Marcus could tell from her serious expression that something important was happening. She slid a folder across the table to him. Inside were photos, statements, and a new piece of information that made Marcus's stomach churn. "This is from a whistleblower," Harris said, her voice low. "A former colleague of Stevens's who's come forward. They've been documenting his actions for years, and it's not just racial profiling. It's worse than we thought." Marcus felt a coldness settle over him as he flipped through the pages. There were reports of misconduct, harassment, and even violent altercations that Stevens had been involved in, all carefully hidden or overlooked by his superiors. Marcus felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could this have gone on for so long? How many others had Stevens hurt, and how many times had people turned a blind eye to his actions? "We have enough now," Harris said, her eyes locked on Marcus. "This is going to change everything." The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Marcus had been pushing forward, fighting for justice, but now it felt like the truth was finally within reach. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it for all the people who had been silenced, for those who had suffered in silence, because they didn't have the courage or the platform to speak out. But even as Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, there was still a nagging fear in the back of his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if the system fought back, as it had so many times before, and allowed Stevens to slip away without consequence? What if, in the end, nothing changed? "I won't stop," Marcus said, his voice firm. "No matter what, we have to see this through." Harris gave him a nod of approval. "I know you won't, and we won't either. We're in this together." Over the next few weeks, things began to move quickly. The evidence continued to pile up, and Stevens was placed under increasing scrutiny. The public started to take notice as well, with news outlets picking up on the story and putting pressure on the authorities to take action. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about exposing a broken system, about showing that the truth could no longer be buried. In the midst of it all, Marcus had moments of doubt, moments where he wondered if it was all worth it. The pressure was intense, and the emotional toll was taking its toll on him. But every time he felt himself slipping, he would remember why he started this fight. It wasn't just for him. It was for every person who had been unfairly targeted, every officer who had tried to make a difference and had been held back by a corrupt system. He knew that if he didn't stand up now, nothing would change. Finally, the day came when the internal investigation into Stevens reached its conclusion. The department announced that Stevens had been fired, and he would face criminal charges for his actions. It was a victory, but it felt bittersweet. Marcus knew that Stevens's punishment was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done to address the systemic issues within law enforcement. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of hope. The fight wasn't over, but it was moving in the right direction. As the news broke, Marcus's phone lit up with messages from his family, his friends, and his colleagues, all congratulating him and thanking him for his courage. But Marcus knew that this victory wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had been hurt by the system, everyone who had been silenced. It had been a long and painful journey, but Marcus had proven that one voice could make a difference. He had stood up, even when it felt like the world was against him, and in the end, he knew that his fight had been worth it. Change was slow, but it was possible. And as he looked ahead, Marcus knew that he would continue to fight, because there were still many more battles to be won.